The wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of ranchers and breeders, men in weathered boots and women in denim jackets, all waiting for the next lot. The air inside the Lexington auction barn was thick with hay dust, sweat, and anticipation. Somewhere in the back, a horse nickered, sharp and restless, cutting through the drone of the auctioneer's microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man's voice rang out, bouncing against the rafters. "Our next lot is unusual. Lot number 32, a 5-year-old Percheron stallion. Wild caught, untrained, no lineage papers. Starting bid at $500. The barn doors groaned open, and the world seemed to tilt. A white giant burst into the ring, nearly 18 hands high, his massive hooves striking sparks from the concrete floor as he reared against the lead ropes. 2 handlers strained to hold him, their boots skidding in sawdust. His mane whipped like a flag of war, his eyes rolling wide with fear and fury. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whistled low. Another voice barked out a laugh. "Good Lord, that's no horse, that's a monster. He'll kill a man quicker than you can saddle him." The stallion slammed sideways into the gate, rattling the metal so violently the auctioneer flinched. Children buried their faces in their mothers' shoulders. Men shook their heads. Nobody wanted trouble. Not here, not with that. Henry Walker sat still among them, his shoulders broad but stooped with age, his silver hair tucked beneath a battered cowboy hat. At 69, cancer gnawed at his lungs, though no one in this barn knew it but him. His chest burned with every breath, but his eyes were steady, clear as flint. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the stallion. Others saw a beast. Henry saw something else. He saw himself, 45 years earlier, stumbling back from the jungles of Vietnam with eyes just as wild, just as mistrusting. No one knew what to do with him then either. He'd been too loud, too broken, too angry, until his grandfather had handed him a shovel and told him to muck the stalls, no questions asked. The quiet of horses had saved him. And now, as the stallion spun and struck, Henry felt that same mirror pull at him. "Starting bid 500, the auctioneer called again, voice faltering. Silence. Not a single hand lifted. 400. Surely someone can see the potential here. A strong draft, worth 2,000 easy, once broke. The stallion lunged, dragging one handler off his feet. Nervous laughter rippled across the bleachers. 300, the auctioneer begged. Heads shook, arms stayed folded. From behind Henry, Tom Harris, his neighbor, and a man who had always been quick with opinions let out a snort. "Can't break what can't be caught. Waste of good money." Henry's gaze never wavered. He saw the tremor in the stallion's flanks, the heaving ribs, the defiance born of fear. Not malice, just misunderstanding. He remembered nights shaking awake from firefights, fists clenched, heart galloping. He remembered people turning away. He remembered what it meant when someone finally stood with him instead of against him. 200, the auctioneer said, desperation bleeding into his words. "Final offer before we move on." Still, no one moved. Henry stood slowly, his joints stiff but his will iron. He lifted his hat slightly, his voice carrying with a calm steadiness. 100. The barn went dead quiet, then erupted. "Henry, you lost your damn mind?" someone jeered. "You'll be in the ground before that thing's broke. Save yourself the trouble, just take out extra insurance." The auctioneer nearly sagged with relief. 100 from Mr. Walker. "Do I hear 150? No? Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Henry Walker." The gavel cracked down. Just like that, ownership passed. The handlers dragged the stallion toward a separate pen, still fighting every step, sweat and foam lathering his neck. The crowd spilled out toward the refreshment stand, shaking their heads, muttering about the foolish old man. "Hope your grandson likes your saddle, Henry," Tom Harris called as he passed, a chuckle buried in his beard. "He'll inherit it soon enough." Henry just tugged his hat back on and walked toward the holding pen. His stallion now threw himself against the fence rails, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring. The power of him was undeniable, terrifying. Henry stopped a safe distance away, his voice low, calm, carrying like a steady stream through the noise. "Easy, boy, easy. I don't know you, and you don't know me, but things are about to change." The horse struck the ground with a front hoof, ears flat, snorting hard as if dismissing the promise. Loading Titan. Henry had already chosen the name silently in his head proved nearly impossible. For 2 hours, the handlers tried ropes, boards, coaxing, cursing. Titan refused every trick. He rammed the trailer walls, denting the steel, screaming his rage. At last, drenched in sweat, they slammed the door shut. Henry signed the paperwork, handed over his $100, and climbed into his truck. His chest hurt with every breath, but the burn was familiar. It meant he was alive. It meant there was still something left to fight for. The drive home rattled with the sound of Titan kicking the trailer, each thud echoing through Henry's bones. When he pulled into the gravel drive of the Walker Ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the fields in gold. Laura was on the porch, arms folded, her expression souring as the trailer door rattled with another violent kick. "Dad," she said flatly, walking toward him. "What in God's name have you done?" "Got us a project," Henry answered simply. "That's not a project. That's a liability." She peered through the slats at the massive white form pacing inside. "He's huge. He'll kill you." "They were going to send him to slaughter," Henry said, his voice even. Laura's face softened, though the worry stayed. She'd grown up on this ranch. She'd inherited his soft spot for lost causes, even when her practical nature fought it. Ethan came jogging from the barn, tall and gangly, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the horse inside. "Holy crap! Grandpa, he's enormous." Henry nodded. "Titan," he said. "That's his name." "Titan?" Laura echoed. "He's carrying the weight of a world he doesn't understand." It took another hour, sweat and patience and quiet persistence, to coax Titan into the back paddock, the only pen with reinforced fencing strong enough to hold him. When the gate slammed shut, Titan exploded into motion, galloping the perimeter, testing every inch of fence, tail streaming like a comet. Henry and Laura stood side by side, silent. Ethan clung to the rail, awestruck. "He's magnificent," Henry murmured, voice reverent. "Just scared, just confused." Laura shook her head, arms hugging herself. "I hope you know what you're doing, Dad. You're not as young as you used to be." "Neither is he," Henry said softly. "We've both got some miles on us. Maybe that's why we'll understand each other." That night, Henry sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. Out in the paddock, Titan paced, restless, untouched hay lying in the corner. The moonlight turned his coat into a ghostly glow, his shadow a restless phantom against the fence. Henry sipped slowly, eyes fixed. He knew that feeling, the need to keep moving, the mistrust of quiet, the fear that rest was a trap. "It'll take time," he murmured to himself. "But we've got that, you and me." Inside, Laura watched her father through the window, worry etched deep. She'd seen that determination before, after storms, after her mother's death, after every hard blow life had dealt. Once Henry set his jaw like that, there was no turning him. But what she couldn't know was what Henry kept secret. The doctor's words, the prognosis hanging over him like a storm cloud. 2 years, maybe 3, if treatments went well. Time was no longer his ally. He hadn't told her, not yet. For now, there was only the horse, the wild giant no one wanted but him. And as Titan reared suddenly in the paddock, slamming against the rails with a crash that shook the night, Henry set his mug down, eyes narrowing, a grim smile tugging his lips. "You'll learn, big fella," he whispered. "We both will." The rails groaned under Titan's weight. The boards held for now. But as the stallion wheeled and struck again, harder, Henry's smile faded. Because if those fences failed tonight, he would have to face the white giant not from behind steel, but in the open dark. And he wondered, was he ready? The storm rolled in without warning. By dusk, clouds had stacked high over the rolling Kentucky hills, swollen and black, shot through with sudden veins of lightning. The Walker Ranch, quiet under the heavy sky, waited like a held breath. In the paddock, Titan paced. His massive body cut a ghostly figure against the darkening horizon, mane lifting in the rising wind. He'd refused hay all afternoon, ignored the bucket of oats Ethan had left. His nerves were raw, the air too charged, the fences too close. Laura stood at the kitchen window, arms crossed tight. "He hasn't stopped moving since you brought him home," she said, her voice sharp with worry. Henry sat at the table behind her, rubbing a hand over his ribs as a cough rattled his chest. "He's figuring things out," he said. "Storm's got him stirred up. Horses don't like feeling trapped when the sky turns." "Neither do I," Laura muttered, watching the stallion slam his chest against the rails, testing every joint. The first thunder cracked, a booming cannon roll that made the windows tremble. Titan reared, screaming, hooves thrashing sparks as they struck steel. Ethan, who had been crouched by the door polishing his boots, leapt to his feet. "Grandpa!" Henry was already rising. He pushed past the pain in his lungs, grabbed his old rain slicker from the peg, and strode out onto the porch. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, thick and electric. Titan was a storm unto himself now, crashing around the paddock, eyes white, foam flinging from his mouth. He hit the corner fence with a roar of wood splintering. The board cracked. "Dad, stop!" Laura cried, chasing after him as Henry stepped into the yard. "You can't go out there. He'll tear you apart." But Henry didn't stop. He walked into the rain as it opened up in sheets, drumming against his hat, plastering his hair to his skull. The fence gave way with a splintering crack. Titan surged through the gap like floodwater bursting a dam, massive body surging into the open field beyond. Lightning lit him up in stark white, a furious god running wild into the dark. "Jesus Christ," Laura gasped, clutching Ethan's shoulder. "We'll never catch him." Henry's gaze followed the stallion as he vanished into the rain, and something old stirred in him, the memory of firefights, the way men scattered, the panic of losing control. He ground his teeth, breath rattling but steady. "Get the truck," he ordered. Minutes later, the battered Ford pickup bounced across the soaked pasture, headlights slicing through the rain. Ethan clung to the dashboard as Henry steered one-handed, scanning the fields. "There," Ethan shouted, pointing. In the headlight's beam, Titan galloped along the ridge, tail streaming, hooves tearing mud. His sheer size made the ground shake. The stallion's muscles glistened under the downpour, a force of nature made flesh. Henry slowed the truck, careful not to push him harder. Titan wheeled suddenly, crashing through tall grass, bolting toward the open gate that led onto the county road. "Grandpa, he's gonna get out," Ethan shouted. Henry braked hard, mud spraying. He flung open his door, staggered into the rain, and stumbled to the gate. With trembling arms, he dragged it shut and chained it fast, just as Titan thundered up. The stallion skidded, nostrils flaring, nearly colliding with the barrier. He spun, ears pinned flat, furious. Rain coursed down his powerful frame as he circled Henry. Laura and Ethan ran up behind, shouting for him to get back, but Henry stood his ground. The storm lashed at him, rain soaking through his clothes, thunder rolling overhead. He planted his boots deep in the mud, chest heaving with every ragged breath. "Easy, boy," he said, his voice calm but carrying. "I'm not moving. I'm not chasing you. You decide." Titan bellowed, striking the ground, mud spraying. Lightning illuminated the whites of his eyes, the trembling muscles in his neck. He was a war machine, built for chaos, and yet he hesitated. Henry's hands hung loose at his sides, open, unthreatening. He didn't flinch when the stallion lunged close enough for the spray of his breath to hit his face. He didn't step back when Titan screamed in his ear, shaking the earth. "I've stood in worse storms than you," Henry whispered. "You'll have to do more than thunder to move me." The rain poured. Titan circled once, twice, then slowed. His breaths came harsh, steaming in the cold. His ears flicked, uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't attacking, he was listening. Henry held still, the mud sucking at his boots, the chain of the gate rattling behind him. "It's your choice, big fella. Out there's the road, the slaughterhouse, the end of the line. In here's a chance. You decide where you belong." Something shifted in Titan's stance. His body trembled, not with rage now, but exhaustion. His head lowered an inch, then another. Finally, with a groan of surrender, he stepped forward, massive frame looming as he crossed the gate's shadow. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped aside, leaving the way open back toward the paddock. Titan hesitated, then walked past him, hooves sinking deep into the mud, tail dragging. Laura's hand clamped over her mouth. Ethan's eyes shone. Henry followed slowly, keeping distance, until Titan slipped back through the broken paddock fence and stopped. The stallion turned, rain pouring off his mane, eyes locking on Henry. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Titan snorted, shook his head, and stood still. The storm roared around them, but the war was over for tonight. Back inside, Laura threw Henry a towel, furious and relieved all at once. "You could have been killed," she snapped. "Not tonight," Henry rasped, coughing hard into the cloth. He tasted copper, wiped it away before she could see. Ethan hovered near the window, staring at the stallion now standing quiet under the rain. "He came back, Grandpa," the boy whispered. "You didn't even have a rope. He just came back." Henry lowered himself into his chair, chest burning, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. "Because I didn't force him," he said. "I gave him the choice." The storm raged until dawn, wind battering the old farmhouse. Henry sat awake most of the night, listening to the steady sound of Titan shifting in the paddock. The stallion didn't try the fence again. He just stood, watching the house with eyes that burned through the rain. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the fields washed clean and glittering under pale sunlight. Titan was still there, mud-caked and weary, but waiting. Henry stepped out onto the porch, lungs aching, the world hazy at the edges. He set his hat on his head and walked toward the paddock. Titan lifted his head, ears pricked, muscles tense. Henry paused at the fence, leaning on the rail. "Morning, Titan," he said softly. The stallion didn't bolt. He didn't charge. He simply stood, staring back. Henry's breath caught. He'd seen that look before the first fragile thread of trust. But then Titan's ears flicked toward the horizon, and his muscles bunched again. Something in him was still restless, still dangerous. Henry knew this was only the beginning, and as he rested his aching hands on the fence post, a question gnawed at him. Had Titan truly chosen to stay, or was he only waiting for the next storm to test his freedom again? The morning after the storm felt almost unreal. The land, scoured by hours of thunder and rain, gleamed as though washed new. Drops of water still clung to the fences like 1,000 tiny diamonds, the pasture alive with the smell of wet earth and crushed grass. Titan stood in the paddock, caked with mud, his white coat streaked with gray, mane tangled from the downpour. But he was still there. He hadn't broken free again. He hadn't tried the fence. Instead, he stood in the corner, head lowered, watching the house with wary eyes. From the porch, Henry Walker leaned against the railing, his body heavy from a night with almost no sleep. The cough in his chest had deepened, each spasm leaving him weaker, but he hid it well. At his side, Ethan balanced on the porch rail, one leg swinging idly. "Think he'll bolt again?" Ethan asked, squinting into the morning light. Henry's gaze never left Titan. "If he wants to, gates can't hold what doesn't want to be here." He tapped his temple. "Only thing that holds a horse like that is up here. His choice." Ethan nodded slowly, chewing on the thought like it was something he'd keep for later. By mid-morning, Henry was out by the paddock with a bucket of fresh water and a flake of alfalfa hay. He didn't go in, just set them by the gate and leaned on the post, his body steady despite the ache gnawing at his ribs. Titan's ears flicked, eyes darting toward him, muscles taut as bowstrings. "Morning, big fella," Henry murmured. "I ain't here to chase you, just here to sit." He eased himself down onto the old stump that had been by the paddock for years. He took a small, battered paperback from his jacket pocket, a Louis L'Amour Western he'd read so many times, the cover was held together with tape. Opening it with care, he began to read aloud, his voice low and steady, words drifting on the morning breeze. Titan didn't move, but his ears twitched, catching the cadence of the voice. For hours, Henry sat and read, pausing only to cough or shift his stiff legs. Titan circled, tested, retreated, then edged closer, curiosity a force stronger than fear. When Henry finally rose to leave, he realized the stallion was standing several yards nearer than when he'd begun. That night, at supper, Laura slammed her fork down. "You're out there all day in the damp, reading to a horse like some fool preacher. You'll make yourself worse." Henry sipped his coffee, unbothered. "It's not about the reading, it's about the time. He needs to know I'll sit there whether he comes or not." Ethan grinned, eyes bright. "Like you're teaching him to trust." Laura shook her head, muttering, "Or teaching him you've lost yours." But she didn't press further. She knew her father well enough to recognize when his mind was set like concrete. Days slipped into weeks, and a rhythm emerged. Every morning, Henry carried water, feed, and his book. He never crowded Titan, never made a grab. He simply existed within the stallion's world. Sometimes he read aloud, sometimes he whittled with his pocket knife, curls of cedar piling at his feet. Slowly, impossibly, the space between them shrank. Titan's snorts grew less frequent, his pacing eased. One morning, Ethan nearly dropped his thermos when Titan stretched his neck within 10 feet of Henry, sniffing cautiously before darting back. Henry only smiled, never reaching out, never rushing. Then came the breakthrough. It was a morning painted gold by sunrise, the air cool, grass wet underfoot. Henry had carried a brush with him into the paddock, not to use but to show. Titan watched, suspicious, muscles quivering. "You've got a coat that wants tending," Henry said softly, holding the brush out where the horse could see. "Not today, maybe, but soon." He sat back on the stump, brush balanced in his palm like an offering. Titan circled warily, ears pricked, eyes rolling white. But after nearly an hour of silent negotiation, he edged forward, nose stretching toward the strange object. His breath puffed against Henry's hand, hot and sharp. Henry didn't move, didn't even blink. And then Titan touched the brush, snorted, and stepped back, but he didn't bolt. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what that meant. A door had cracked open. That evening, Ethan bounded into the kitchen, face flushed. He sniffed at Mom. Grandpa held out the brush, and Titan came right to him. Laura stared at her father across the table. "So what? That's not training. That's stalling. You're wasting what time you have left." Henry's spoon clattered against the bowl, his eyes locked on hers, tired but burning. "It's not wasted if it matters, and it matters to him and to me." Laura bit her lip, her anger softening into fear. She didn't answer. The next morning, Henry carried the brush again. This time, when Titan approached, Henry lifted it just an inch higher. The stallion tensed, ready to spring, but Henry murmured steady words, voice like gravel smoothed by water. "Easy now, it's just a touch." With agonizing slowness, Henry extended his arm. The brush grazed Titan's neck. The stallion flinched, every muscle jolting, but he didn't bolt. He stood, trembling, eyes wide. Henry drew the brush down in one slow stroke, mud flaking away. Titan shuddered, then stilled. "There you are," Henry whispered, hands steady despite the weakness in his limbs. "Feels better, don't it?" By the time he stepped back, Titan's eyes were half closed, his breathing calm. A line had been crossed. Trust had begun to bloom. From the house, Ethan whooped in amazement. Laura stood frozen at the window, a hand pressed to her mouth. That night, Henry's cough racked him until he nearly couldn't catch his breath. Laura brought his medication, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. You're killing yourself for a horse." Henry took the pills with a grimace, then smiled faintly. "No, Laura, he's the one keeping me alive." The weeks that followed deepened the bond. Titan allowed brushing now, then haltering, then leading in cautious circles around the paddock. He startled at sudden noises, but each time Henry stayed calm, his presence anchoring the storm inside the stallion. Word spread. Neighbors who'd laughed at Henry's purchase began driving slowly past the ranch, curious to glimpse the white monster who now stood quiet under the old man's hand. But Henry knew it wasn't enough. Trust earned in the paddock was fragile. Titan needed more. One evening, as twilight bled across the hills, John Patterson pulled his truck into the drive. He leaned on the fence, watching Titan follow Henry in slow, deliberate steps. "I'll be damned," Patterson muttered. "That horse was hell on hooves at the auction. Now he's walking after you like a dog." Henry chuckled, patting Titan's neck. "Not a dog, a partner." Patterson shook his head. "Well, if you're looking to prove it, the Founders' Day parade's coming up. They're always short a showpiece. A big white draft like him? Folks would lose their minds." Laura, who had come out with iced tea, nearly dropped the tray. "Absolutely not. He's barely halter broke, Dad. You can't put him in a parade." But Ethan's eyes lit up. "Grandpa, could we? Titan in the parade? That'd show everyone." Henry didn't answer. He stroked Titan's neck, staring out over the fading fields. The stallion leaned into his hand, the faintest gesture of trust. The old soldier inside Henry stirred again, the one who knew life was measured not in days left, but in what you did with them. As the last light drained from the sky, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Maybe it's time we showed them what second chances look like." Titan finally begins to trust Henry, allowing grooming and haltering. The bond has shifted from wary coexistence to fragile partnership. Yet, as John Patterson suggests the Founders' Day parade, Henry glimpses a chance to prove Titan's transformation to the whole community. But the unspoken question hangs in the air. Is Henry pushing too far, too fast for Titan, or for himself? Morning sunlight spilled across the Walker Ranch like a benediction after the storm. The land was washed clean, the fences gleaming with droplets, the pastures steaming in the cool air. But the true miracle wasn't the landscape, it was the fact that Titan was still there. The white stallion stood in the paddock, mud streaked across his powerful flanks, mane tangled, eyes sharp and watchful. He hadn't tried the fence again. He hadn't run. He was waiting, though what for, nobody knew. Henry sat on the porch, wrapped in his worn denim jacket, coffee steaming in his hands. Every cough rattled his chest, but he kept his gaze fixed on Titan. Beside him, Ethan leaned forward eagerly, his boyish face pale from lack of sleep, but his eyes alight with questions. "You think he stayed because he trusts you now?" Ethan asked, voice hopeful. Henry gave a slow shake of his head. "Trust ain't built in one storm, kid. He stayed because something told him it wasn't time to go. Now it's up to me to give him a reason to keep staying." That morning, Henry carried a bucket of clean water and a flake of hay to the paddock. He didn't step inside. He just set them down and lowered himself onto the old stump by the fence. From his coat pocket, he pulled a battered paperback, pages yellowed, cover held together with tape. He opened it and began to read aloud, voice low and steady, carrying just enough to reach Titan's twitching ears. For hours, Henry Saturday. He didn't move toward Titan. He didn't demand anything. The stallion circled, snorting, tail lashing, but curiosity tugged at him like gravity. By the time Henry rose to leave, Titan had inched several yards closer, ears flicking nervously but not hostile. At supper that night, Laura shook her head. "You're wasting your strength sitting out there, mumbling to a horse. You need rest, not fairy tales." Henry spooned stew into his mouth without looking up. "It's not the words, it's the time." He's learning I'm not going anywhere." Ethan grinned across the table. "Like, you're showing him he can count on you." Laura clenched her jaw, but she didn't argue further. She knew that stubborn glint in her father's eyes. It was the same look he'd had the day he bought Titan, and the same look he'd had when he rebuilt the barn after the tornado years ago. Days blurred into weeks. A pattern took hold. Henry carried water and hay, sometimes a brush tucked under his arm, and settled on the stump. He read, whittled, or simply sat in silence while Titan watched from a distance. Slowly, the stallion's wild energy shifted. His pacing lessened, his ears no longer pinned flat at every movement. One morning, Ethan gasped aloud when Titan stretched his neck to sniff the air just 10 feet away before darting back. "See that?" Ethan whispered. "He almost touched you." Henry only smiled. Almost is the first step. The real breakthrough came on a morning painted in soft gold. Henry entered the paddock holding a curry brush. Titan stiffened, muscles rippling, but Henry kept his movements slow, deliberate. "You've got a coat wants tending," Henry said, voice calm. He held the brush low, not forcing, just offering. Not today, maybe, but soon. He sat back down and waited. Titan circled, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. Finally, with agonizing slowness, the stallion stretched his neck forward, sniffed the brush, and snorted loudly. He didn't flee. Henry's pulse quickened. He hadn't reached out, he'd let Titan come to him. That was the first true crack in the wall. The next day, Henry tried again. Titan approached more quickly this time, curious. With infinite patience, Henry lifted the brush an inch higher. Titan's body tensed, hooves shuffling. "Easy now," Henry murmured. "Just a touch." He extended the brush. It grazed Titan's thick neck. The stallion jolted, muscles quivering, but he didn't bolt. Henry drew the brush down in one long stroke. Mud and sweat flaked away. Titan snorted but stayed put, eyes wide with something between fear and relief. "That's it, big fella," Henry whispered. "Feels better, don't it?" By the time he stepped back, Titan's eyes had softened, lids drooping slightly. He'd accepted the brush. He'd accepted the man. From the fence, Ethan's voice cracked with awe. "You touched him, Grandpa. You actually touched him." Laura stood on the porch, hands trembling around her coffee mug. She wanted to argue, to scold, but the sight of Titan standing still under her father's hand stole her breath. That night, Henry's coughing kept him awake. Laura pressed medication into his hand, her own eyes wet. "You're killing yourself out there," she whispered. Henry swallowed the pills, then gave her a weary smile. "No, honey, he's the one keeping me alive." The bond deepened with each passing day. Titan allowed brushing now, even haltering. Henry led him in small circles, his voice the anchor when the stallion startled. Titan responded, tentative but willing, each lesson a stitch in the fragile fabric of trust. The neighbors noticed. Trucks slowed on the county road, eyes craning for a glimpse of the infamous white monster now walking quietly beside an old man. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others tipped their hats in silent respect. Then one evening, John Patterson pulled his truck into the drive. He leaned against the fence, watching Henry lead Titan in slow circles. "Well, I'll be damned," Patterson muttered. "That horse was hellfire at the auction. Now, look at him following you like a dog." Henry chuckled, patting Titan's shoulder. "Not a dog, a partner." Patterson sipped from his thermos. "Founders' Day parade's coming up. Committees looking for showpieces. A big white draft like him? Folks would lose their minds." Laura, who had just stepped out with iced tea, nearly dropped the tray. "Are you insane? He's barely halter broke, Dad. You can't throw him into a parade." But Ethan's eyes lit like lanterns. "Grandpa, imagine it Titan in the parade. Everyone would see he's not a monster." Henry didn't answer right away. He rubbed Titan's neck, staring out over the twilight fields. The stallion leaned into his hand, a quiet gesture of trust. The old soldier inside Henry stirred, the part of him that still believed in proving something, in standing tall before the world. As the sun slipped below the hills, Henry's voice was almost a whisper, more to himself than to them. "Maybe it's time we showed them what second chances look like." Titan finally accepts Henry's touch and begins training, their bond solidifying into fragile trust. But with Patterson's suggestion of the parade, a new challenge looms, to prove Titan's transformation before the entire town. Yet Laura's fear lingers, and Henry's own strength wanes. The question looms in the fading light. Can Henry push both himself and Titan toward the spotlight, or will the weight of his illness shatter everything they've built? The days after Patterson's suggestion hung heavy in the Walker house. Laura's protests echoed at every turn, but Henry remained silent, retreating into the same quiet determination that had carried him through battlefields and broken barns. Ethan, meanwhile, buzzed with barely contained excitement, sketching crude drawings of Titan decked in parade ribbons, whispering to his grandfather about colors, flags, and what songs the high school band might play. Titan, as always, stood at the center of it all, silent, massive, waiting. Henry began the new regimen quietly, almost ritualistic in its simplicity. He carried flags into the paddock, nothing fancy, just old bandanas tied to broom handles. Ethan waved them clumsily at first, the cloth snapping in the air. Titan spooked hard, eyes rolling, muscles bunching as though to leap over the fence. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured, stepping between the flag and the horse. His voice was the still point in the chaos, grounding them both. "It's just noise, just color. It can't hurt you." They started at 50 feet, then 40, then 30. Every day the flags came closer, and every day Henry stood unflinching, calm as stone, until Titan lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and decided maybe the flapping things weren't demons after all. Laura watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, her coffee cold by the time she realized she hadn't taken a sip. Each time Henry stumbled on his way back from the paddock, she bit her lip until it bled. But she never called him in. She knew better. Noise training came next. An old stereo, rescued from the attic, sat at the edge of the field, its speakers warbling with the tinny blare of a marching band. At the first blare of trumpets, Titan reared, tearing grooves into the dirt. Henry's boots dug deep, his voice carrying above the music. "Stand your ground, that's all you've got to do." By the 5th day, Titan hardly flicked an ear at the cymbals. But the effort was carving into Henry. The coughing grew deeper, the nights longer. Sometimes, Ethan found him at the kitchen table, slumped over his training journal, pen still in hand, pages covered in shaky handwriting. Flag 15 feet, stereo level 3, progress slow but steady. Ethan tried to take the pen once, telling him to rest. Henry only smiled, eyes bright through the exhaustion. "If I don't write it down, who's going to carry it after me?" The saddle came next. Heavy leather Henry had bought years ago, now dragged out of storage, smelling of dust and oil. Titan eyed it like a predator watching a trap. He sidestepped violently when Henry first approached, nearly trampling the bucket. "Not today," Henry said, stepping back, leaving the saddle on the fence. "Today you just look at it. Tomorrow we try again." It took a week before Titan allowed the saddle to rest across his broad back, the girth hanging loose. Another week before Henry cinched it gently while murmuring, "Easy, big fella, this is no prison, just a conversation between us." The first time Titan accepted the weight without bolting, Henry exhaled a breath that rattled like dry leaves. He rested his forehead briefly against the stallion's shoulder, whispering, "Thank you." Ethan cheered from the fence. Laura, standing behind him, wiped at her eyes before anyone could see. But progress came with price. One afternoon, as Henry led Titan around the paddock under saddle, a truck backfired on the nearby road. The sharp crack tore through the air like gunfire. Titan lunged sideways, rope jerking hard. Henry stumbled, dropping to one knee, chest clutched tight as a jagged memory ripped through him helicopters, shouting, "The jungle closing in." "Grandpa!" Ethan scrambled over the fence, grabbing his arm. Titan spun at the end of the rope, wild-eyed, but didn't bolt. Instead, he circled back, nostrils flaring, ears pricked toward Henry. The stallion stopped just feet away, trembling, as though he too felt the echo of war. Henry forced himself upright, leaning heavy on Ethan. His voice came rough but steady. "I'm all right. We're both all right." That night, Laura confronted him. "This has to stop. You're pushing him, and you're pushing yourself. One of you is going to break." Henry sat silent at the kitchen table, the lamplight carving deep shadows into his face. Finally, he lifted his eyes, weary but burning with conviction. "We've both been broken before. This time, maybe we fix each other." Laura pressed her lips together, unable to answer. She turned away so he wouldn't see the tears streaking her cheeks. Training intensified. Titan learned to walk the county road, cars slowing respectfully as they passed the enormous stallion, guided by an old man with silver hair. Henry's hand never trembled on the rope, though his legs sometimes did. One evening, Patterson returned, leaning on the fence as Titan completed a slow, steady circle. "Parade's in 3 weeks. You gonna put him in?" Henry glanced at Titan, sweat streaking his white coat, then back at Patterson. "We'll be ready." Laura nearly slammed the door when she heard it, but in the quiet of her room that night, she whispered a prayer into her pillow, not for the parade, but for her father's strength to last long enough to see it. The final hurdle came sooner than expected. Henry decided it was time. With Ethan and Laura watching anxiously, he placed one foot in the stirrup and, with a grunt that tore through his chest, swung into the saddle. Titan froze, muscles bunched, but Henry's voice steadied him. Easy now. Just me. Just us. The stallion shifted, then took a step. Another. Henry sat tall, every line of his body remembering decades of horsemanship. A smile cracked across his face, erasing years of pain. From the fence, Ethan shouted, "He's riding him, Mom! He's really riding him!" Laura pressed her hand to her mouth. She wanted to tell them both to stop, to get down, to go back inside before something terrible happened. But when she saw the look on her father's face, joy, pure and unfiltered, she stayed silent. Henry guided Titan in a slow circle, then another. The stallion's stride lengthened, his ears flicking back to catch the old man's murmurs. They moved together, horse and rider, the world shrinking to just the two of them. When Henry finally dismounted, his legs nearly buckled. Ethan ran to steady him. Henry laughed, breathless. "First ride. We'll make a horse of him yet." That night, he sat at the porch with his training journal, coughing until his ribs ached. Ethan hovered nearby. "Grandpa, is it worth it, even if it makes you worse?" Henry closed the book, gazing at the dark paddock where Titan grazed quietly. "Kid, some things are worth every breath you've got left. This is one of them." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sound of Titan tearing grass. Then, the stallion lifted his head suddenly, ears flicking toward the far hills. A low rumble drifted across the valley, not thunder, but the growl of engines. Headlights bobbed in the distance, winding down the county road toward the ranch. Henry narrowed his eyes, unease prickling his spine. Visitors weren't common here, not at this hour. Ethan followed his gaze. "Who is that, Grandpa?" Henry didn't answer. His hand tightened around the journal in his lap. The lights drew closer, cutting through the night. Titan snorted, stamping, restless again. Whatever was coming, it would test them in ways neither storm nor training had yet done. Henry and Titan achieved their first ride together, proving the impossible bond. Yet, just as the family tastes triumph, the arrival of unexpected vehicles on the lonely county road threatens to shatter their fragile peace. Who is coming in the night, and what do they want with a dying man and his untamable horse? The headlights cut through the Kentucky dark like twin blades, crawling down the county road that led straight to the Walker Ranch. The rumble of engines grew louder, unsettling the night air. Titan snorted, ears pricked, stamping in the paddock as though he sensed something unwelcome in the approach. On the porch, Henry straightened slowly, his hand tightening on his training journal. Ethan, perched on the rail, glanced nervously between his grandfather and the approaching lights. "Who do you think it is, Grandpa?" the boy whispered. Henry didn't answer. His jaw clenched, memories flickering late-night visits in another world, the low growl of vehicles that never meant anything good. His chest tightened, not just from illness, but from instinct. 2 trucks rolled up the drive, tires crunching gravel. They stopped short of the house, engines idling, doors opened. Out stepped 3 men, strangers. They weren't neighbors, and they weren't friendly. The lead man was thick around the middle, but carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. His jacket, even in the low light, gleamed with too much polish. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," he called, voice smooth as oil. "Sorry to bother you this late." Henry stayed seated on the porch, Ethan beside him. "State your business," Henry said flatly. The man chuckled. "Straight to it, huh? My name's Randall Hodge. I represent a client interested in that fine animal you've got out there." He gestured toward Titan, who stood tall against the night, massive frame, glowing pale in the moonlight. Henry's silence was heavy. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "You bought him cheap at auction," Randall continued. "But a horse like that? He's worth a fortune if handled right. My client's offering 10 grand, cash, tonight." Ethan's eyes widened. $10,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined. But Henry didn't flinch. He set his mug down with deliberate calm. "He's not for sale." Randall's smile tightened. "Come now, Mr. Walker. Old horsemen like you know what it takes to manage an animal like that. He's no backyard pony. He needs training, space, handling. Dangerous, too. A liability." "Not to me," Henry said, his voice like gravel. Randall's gaze flicked toward Ethan, then back to Henry. "Think about your family. Think about what happens when that thing breaks a fence and hurts somebody. You'd carry that weight, wouldn't you? My offer stands for tonight. After that, the horse might become a problem." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Titan tossed his head violently, pawing the ground as if he understood. Henry rose slowly, the porch boards creaking beneath his boots. He leaned on the railing, his breath ragged but his stance unyielding. This ranch has seen storms, wars, and fools with money in their pockets. You can tell your client Titan stays where he is. Randall's smile vanished. He nodded once to his men. "Suit yourself, old man. Don't say I didn't warn you." They turned back to their trucks, gravel spraying as engines roared and headlights vanished into the distance. Ethan exhaled shakily. "Grandpa, what if they come back?" Henry sat again, coughing hard into his fist. When he looked up, his eyes were clear. "Then we'll be ready." The next days felt uneasy. Laura noticed strangers lingering at the feed store. Questions whispered about the white monster in Henry's paddock. At night, headlights sometimes slowed on the road, watching too long before speeding off. Henry didn't let it deter him. If anything, he doubled down. Titan's training continued road work, desensitization, longer rides. Ethan helped, his hands steady on the lead rope, his voice calm as his grandfather's. Titan responded, each day more willing, more focused. But the shadow of Randall's threat lingered. One evening, Ethan was brushing Titan when he noticed a jagged cut along the horse's flank. Fresh, not deep, but deliberate. "Grandpa," Ethan cried, panic in his voice. "Somebody hurt him." Henry's face went pale as he examined the wound. It wasn't from fencing or brush. It was a warning. Laura demanded they call the sheriff. "This has gone too far. They're dangerous men, Dad. You can't fight them." Henry's jaw set. "I've faced worse." He stroked Titan's neck, whispering softly until the stallion calmed. "They want to break us down, but they don't know what second chances mean on this ranch." Still, at night, Henry sat awake in his chair, watching the paddock through the window. Titan often stood facing the road, ears pricked, as though standing guard. Then came the breaking point. It was near midnight when Ethan shook Henry awake. "Grandpa, listen!" The distant hum of engines filled the night. Headlights bobbed on the horizon, then cut across the pasture, beams sweeping the paddock. Titan reared, screaming, hooves striking sparks. "They're back," Ethan whispered, fear in his eyes. Henry grabbed his shotgun from behind the door, the old steel cool in his trembling hands. Laura burst in, pale with fear. "Dad, don't please!" Henry's voice was iron. "I won't fire unless I have to, but I won't let them take him." Outside, the truck stopped by the broken fence line. Men spilled out, flashlights sweeping. Titan thundered in circles, a white storm in the dark. Randall's voice carried, cold and sharp. "Easy now, boy. Time to come with us. Old man Walker can't keep you safe forever." Henry stepped into the yard, shotgun across his arm. "You'll leave this place now?" Randall smirked in the glow of his flashlight. "Or what? You'll drop us where you stand? You haven't got the strength, Walker, and when you're gone, that horse will still be mine." Titan screamed, striking the ground. The standoff crackled with danger, silence cut by the stallion's fury and the rasp of Henry's labored breathing. For a moment, everything teetered between peace and violence, between holding on and losing everything. Then, out of the dark, another set of headlights appeared. Blue and red strobes lit the night. A siren whooped once, sharp and final. Sheriff's deputies pulled in, tires spitting gravel. Randall cursed under his breath, his men scrambling back to the trucks. Engines roared, tires squealed, and in seconds they vanished into the night. Henry lowered the shotgun, his arms shaking, breath ragged. Titan trotted to the fence line, chest heaving, eyes blazing, as though ready to charge after them. The sheriff's deputy stepped out, flashlight beams sweeping the yard. "Evening, Mr. Walker. Got a call about trespassers." Laura's hands trembled as she clutched Ethan close. Henry only nodded, voice low. "You got here just in time." But even as the deputy promised patrols on the road, Henry knew the truth. Randall wasn't finished. Later, when the house was quiet again, Henry stepped onto the porch. Titan stood by the fence, watching him, mane glinting silver in the moonlight. Henry's chest ached with more than illness. He whispered across the dark, "They'll be back, boy, and we'll have to be stronger than ever." The Walkers faced their first direct confrontation with Randall and his men. Titan is threatened, wounded, and nearly taken. But the sheriff's intervention drives the intruders off. The family breathes relief, but Henry knows it's temporary. Randall won't give up so easily. And as the Founders' Day parade draws closer, one question looms like a storm on the horizon. Can Titan stand before the whole town when danger still prowls in the shadows? The sheriff's cruiser came and went, its taillights vanishing into the black Kentucky night. But the echo of Randall's threat clung to the Walker ranch like smoke. Every creak of the house, every groan of the barn boards set Laura on edge. Ethan barely slept, waking at the sound of coyotes and rushing to the window to check that Titan was still there. Henry, though, carried himself with a strange calm. He had faced worse in jungles far from home, he told himself. But the truth was written in his hollowed cheeks, in the rasp of his breath, in the way he gripped the rail when he thought no one was looking. Titan, too, had changed. He no longer paced like a prisoner. Instead, he stood sentinel, ears pricked toward the road, muscles taut whenever headlights slowed in the distance, as if he knew he was being hunted. 3 days after the midnight standoff, Henry gathered his family in the kitchen. Laura's arms were crossed, Ethan perched on the counter, wide-eyed. "I won't sugarcoat it," Henry began, voice steady. "Randall will come again. But we can't live scared. We'll finish Titan's training, and we'll ride him in that parade. Not just for us, but to show this whole town he's more than what they fear." Laura shook her head in disbelief. "Dad, you're sick. You're coughing blood some nights. And now you want to march a half-broke horse through town with criminals gunning for him?" Henry's eyes burned. Fear doesn't get to write the ending of this story. Not mine, not his. Silence followed, broken only by the tick of the kitchen clock. Finally, Ethan whispered, "Then I'll help, whatever it takes." The next weeks were grueling. Dawn to dusk, Henry worked with Titan. Flags, drums, recorded traffic sounds, even Laura's vacuum cleaner dragged onto the porch to rattle and hum. Titan spooked, sweated, reared, but each time, Henry stood firm, murmuring steady words until the stallion stilled. One morning, Henry led Titan down the gravel drive toward the county road. Cars slowed, windows rolling down, neighbors pointing in disbelief at the sight of the white giant stepping calmly beside the frail old man. Children waved. Titan flicked an ear, but he didn't bolt. By evening, gossip had spread. Henry Walker's monster horse is tame. He's going to ride him in the parade. Some scoffed, others laughed, but a few began to hope. The night before the parade, the ranch was unusually still. Titan grazed in the paddock, moonlight silvering his coat. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too excited to sleep. Laura moved quietly through the house, folding clothes, her worry gnawing at her heart. Henry sat at the table, training journal open before him. His handwriting had grown shaky, ink blotched where his hand trembled. "Parade tomorrow. Titan ready. I hope I am." The sound of gravel crunching outside shattered the stillness. Headlights swept across the walls. Ethan bolted upright. "Grandpa!" Henry grabbed the shotgun. Laura ran to Ethan's room. Together, they pressed to the window. 2 trucks again. Randall's men. They didn't bother with stealth this time. Doors slammed, flashlights cut across the yard. Henry stepped onto the porch, shotgun leveled. "You got nerve coming back here?" he growled. Randall emerged from the shadows, smile thin as a blade. "Last chance, old man. You ride that horse in town tomorrow. You'll regret it. My client doesn't like competition." Henry's voice rang out. "Titan isn't for sale. Not today, not ever." Randall's smile dropped. He signaled to his men. One hurled something into the paddock, a glass bottle that shattered, flames blooming across the grass. "No!" Ethan screamed. Titan screamed louder, rearing back, eyes wild as firelight danced across his coat. Henry fired a warning shot into the air. The blast cracked through the night. Randall's men scattered, cursing, scrambling into their trucks. Engines roared, gravel flew, and in seconds they were gone, taillights vanishing into the dark. But the fire remained. Flames licked toward the fence, hungry, devouring. Titan lunged, trapped, slamming against the rails. "Dad!" Laura cried, panic-stricken. Henry didn't hesitate. He dropped the shotgun, grabbed a bucket, and sprinted toward the barn. Ethan followed, hauling another. Together, they doused the flames, the acrid smoke stinging their lungs, coughing them raw. Titan crashed at the fence, foam flying from his mouth, eyes rolling white. Henry threw himself into the paddock, hands raised. "Titan, look at me, not the fire me." The stallion froze, chest heaving, ears locked on Henry's voice. For a heartbeat, firelight reflected in his eyes, wild and terrified. Henry took a step closer. "I've stood in worse hell than this, boy. You're not alone." Titan snorted, then, impossibly, lowered his head. Henry slipped the halter on, leading him away from the flames while Ethan beat down the last embers with a soaked blanket. When the fire was out, the yard reeked of smoke. Henry leaned heavy against Titan's shoulder, coughing blood into his sleeve. Laura saw it this time, her face twisting with fear. "Dad," she whispered. Henry wiped his mouth, forcing a smile. Still here, still breathing. But in her eyes, Laura saw the truth. He was fading. The next morning, word of the fire spread through town. Some said it was kids, others whispered Randall's name, but all eyes turned toward Henry Walker. Would he still dare bring the white giant to the parade? Henry didn't falter. He saddled Titan at dawn, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. Ethan stood by, eyes shining with pride and fear. Laura hovered, torn between begging him to stop and knowing nothing could. "Ready, boy?" Henry whispered into Titan's ear. The stallion snorted, pawing the dirt as if answering. As the sun broke over the horizon, the Walker family set out down the road, an old man, a boy, and a horse born wild, walking toward the town that waited to judge them. And somewhere in the hills beyond, Randall watched from behind the wheel of his truck, cigarette burning low between his fingers. His smile returned, thin and cruel. "Let the parade begin," he muttered. Henry proves Titan's trust by leading him through fire, but the confrontation with Randall escalates the ranch attacked. Titan nearly lost, Henry's illness exposed. Still, Henry resolves to ride in the parade, knowing it may be his last stand. But as the day dawns and the town gathers, one question overshadows the celebration. Will the parade become their triumph or Randall's revenge? Main Street in Lexington bloomed with color. Banners fluttered between lampposts, the brass band warmed up on the courthouse steps, and children darted between booths, sticky with cotton candy. The Founders' Day parade was always the town's pride, but this year, a different anticipation buzzed beneath the chatter. Everyone had heard the rumors. Everyone was waiting for the moment the old man and his monstrous horse would appear. Henry Walker adjusted his hat, coughing into a kerchief, before tucking it discreetly into his pocket. His lungs burned, but he hid it behind a steady posture. Titan stood beside him, gleaming after Ethan's careful grooming, his white coat brushing the morning Sunday. A red ribbon tied loosely to his bridle fluttered like a battle flag. Ethan, dressed in his best shirt, patted Titan's shoulder nervously. "He looks ready, Grandpa. But, are you?" Henry's smile was thin, but his eyes shone. "Doesn't matter if I'm ready. What matters is that he is." Laura hovered close, her face pale. She had argued until the last minute, but now she stood guard, jaw tight, eyes scanning the crowd. She didn't trust the town, and she sure as hell didn't trust Randall. The parade began with the usual fanfare, marching band, Boy Scouts, floats plastered with balloons. The crowd clapped and cheered, but when Titan stepped onto Main Street, the noise shifted. Gasps rippled, then silence fell heavy. The stallion moved with slow, deliberate grace, his hooves striking the asphalt like drums. Children pressed closer to their parents, unsure if they should be afraid or awed. Men who had once laughed at Henry's foolish purchase now stood slack-jawed. Titan was no monster now. He was majesty incarnate. Henry sat tall in the saddle, every line of his body etched with pride and defiance. Ethan walked at Titan's side, hand on the lead rope, his chest swelling with pride. Laura followed close, eyes never leaving the crowd. Then the first cheer broke. A boy waved, shouting, "Look, Mama, the white giant." Applause swelled, hesitant at first, then rolling like thunder. Titan flicked an ear, muscles twitching, but Henry's voice murmured steady reassurance. The stallion lifted his head higher, as if he understood the moment. But danger simmered beneath the celebration. Randall leaned against his truck at the far end of Main Street, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes cold. Two of his men blended into the crowd, hands hidden beneath jackets. They weren't here to cheer. As Titan approached the courthouse steps, the brass band struck up louder. Cymbals crashed, drums thundered. The stallion flinched, muscles coiling, but Henry's hand stayed steady, his words a low hum. "It's all right, boy, just music, just noise." Titan breathed hard, then steadied, walking on. The crowd erupted into cheers. People clapped, shouted his name, the fear dissolving into awe. Ethan grinned, pride flooding him. Laura let out a shaky breath, her hands finally unclenching. For one shining moment, it seemed they had won. Then chaos struck. A firecracker exploded near the curb, sharp and vicious. Titan screamed, rearing high, hooves slashing the air. The crowd shrieked, scattering. Children cried, parents dragged them away. Henry's body jolted in the saddle. He clung tight, coughing hard as the stallion thrashed beneath him. Ethan grabbed the lead rope, shouting, "Easy, Titan! It's me! It's Ethan!" Laura's eyes darted. In the chaos, she spotted him, Randall's man, smoke still curling from the match he'd dropped, a cruel smile on his face. "Coward!" she hissed, pushing through the panicked crowd. Henry fought for control, his chest seizing. Black dots swam in his vision. Titan bucked, nearly unseating him. "Grandpa!" Ethan cried, yanking the rope with all his strength. Titan's wild eyes found the boy, nostrils flaring, ears flicking. For a heartbeat, trust warred with terror. Henry forced air into his burning lungs. "Listen to him, Titan. He's your anchor now. Not me. Him." Titan's chest heaved, foam flying from his mouth. Then, slowly, impossibly, he stilled under Ethan's touch. The boy's trembling hand stroked his neck, his voice breaking but steady. "You're safe. You're safe. We've got you." The crowd gasped, then roared. What they saw wasn't just a horse tamed, it was a bond, raw and undeniable, forged in trust. Randall's smirk faltered. His man cursed under his breath, slipping back into the panicked crowd. The firecracker had failed to break them. Instead, it had cemented something unshakable. Henry slumped slightly in the saddle, sweat pouring down his face, his cough racking him so hard Ethan had to grab his leg to steady him. But he raised his head, eyes blazing, and tipped his hat to the crowd. The cheers were deafening. The parade rolled on, Titan leading with regal strides, Ethan at his side, Laura shadowing them with fierce protectiveness. For now, they had won the moment. But as they left Main Street, Randall flicked his cigarette to the pavement, grinding it beneath his boot. His smile returned, colder than before. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself. "Let them celebrate. Tomorrow, we take what's ours." Henry, Ethan, and Titan triumph in the parade, winning the town's admiration and proving their bond. Yet Randall's sabotage attempt shows the danger is far from over. The family breathes a fragile sigh of relief, but the shadow of vengeance lingers. And as night falls, one question looms darker than ever. Will their greatest victory become the prelude to their greatest loss? The cheers from the parade still echoed in Ethan's mind long after they left Main Street. For the first time since Titan had entered their lives, the boy felt the world believe what he had always known. The horse was not a monster, but a miracle. Yet, as the Walker family returned to their quiet ranch, shadows pressed close again. Henry could feel it in his bones. Triumph was fleeting. Men like Randall never disappeared after losing face. They regrouped, they struck harder. And Henry, an old soldier, knew the signs of an enemy waiting for nightfall. Laura noticed it too. She locked every door, checked every window, double-latched the barn, but her hands shook as she poured coffee, her mind looping through the sight of Randall's smirk at the parade's end. That night, the ranch was silent, but for the chorus of crickets. Titan stood restless in the paddock, ears pricked, pacing the fence line. Henry sat on the porch, shotgun across his knees, chest rattling with every breath. Ethan refused to go to bed, curling on the steps beside him, stubborn eyes mirroring his grandfather's. "Go on inside, kid," Henry rasped. "If something comes, you'll need your strength." Ethan shook his head fiercely. "No, Titan needs us, and you need me." Henry managed a faint smile, pride and sorrow tangled in his expression. "You're your mother's son, all right, stubborn to the bone." The rumble of engines broke the night. Headlights slashed across the pasture, 2 trucks, then 3. Randall wasn't hiding anymore. He had come with force. "Stay behind me," Henry ordered, rising slow, steadying himself against the rail. His body screamed protest, but his spirit stood iron. Titan screamed, rearing in the paddock, hooves thundering like war drums. Randall stepped from the lead truck, smug in the glare of floodlights. "Evening, Walker. Fine show you put on today. The town loved it. Shame it'll be his last." Henry leveled the shotgun. "You set 1 foot closer, and you'll find out just how much fight an old man's got left." Randall spread his hands mockingly. "I don't need to lift a finger. My men will do it. That horse belongs to us now." The goons moved forward, ropes and tranquilizer darts gleaming under the lights. Titan roared, slamming against the fence, fury incarnate. "Grandpa, what do we do?" Ethan's voice shook, but his grip on Henry's sleeve was strong. Henry's eyes never left Randall. "We don't give him up. Not tonight, not ever." Chaos exploded. The men rushed the paddock, flashlights swinging. Titan charged the fence, splintering rails, his body crashing through with raw, unstoppable power. For the first time, he wasn't trying to escape, he was protecting his home. He barreled into the intruders, sending one sprawling into the mud, another scrambling for cover. Flashlights scattered, shouts filled the air. Ethan grabbed a lantern, waving it wildly to blind them. Laura burst from the house, phone in hand, shouting that the sheriff was on his way. Randall cursed, pulling a pistol from his coat. "Enough games!" He raised it, aiming straight at Titan. "No!" Henry roared. His voice cracked the night as he stepped forward, placing himself between Randall and the charging stallion. The shot rang out. Ethan's scream split the darkness. Titan reared, hooves slashing at the sky, a sound like thunder rolling out of his chest. Randall stumbled back, eyes wide as the stallion bore down on him. The pistol flew from Randall's hand, swallowed by the mud. Henry collapsed to his knees, clutching his side, breath rattling. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Grandpa!" Ethan cried, falling beside him. Titan loomed over Randall, who scrambled backward until his back hit the wheel of his truck. The stallion's nostrils flared, teeth bared, fury radiating from every inch of his massive frame. One strike would end it, but Henry's voice, weak but steady, cut through the storm. "Titan, enough. We're not killers. Not tonight." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Titan lowered his head, snorting hard, and stepped back, leaving Randall trembling in the dirt. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Red and blue strobes soon painted the ranch. Deputies poured out, weapons drawn. Randall and his men were forced to the ground, cuffs snapping around their wrists. Laura rushed to Henry's side, tears streaking her face. "Dad, hold on. Please hold on." Henry's hand trembled as it reached for Ethan's shoulder. You kept him steady. You and Titan, stronger than me now." "Don't talk like that," Ethan sobbed, clutching him tight. Henry's gaze found Titan, who stood still now, chest heaving, eyes locked on him. The stallion stepped closer, lowering his massive head until it nearly brushed Henry's arm. "You proved it, boy," Henry whispered. "You're more than what they said. You're free." His body sagged, breath shallow, but a faint smile lingered. Paramedics rushed in, voices urgent, hands working fast. Ethan was pulled back, Laura clinging to him, her sobs muffled in his hair. Titan remained unmoving, as though guarding Henry with his very presence. Hours later, dawn broke pale over the ranch. Randall's trucks were gone, his men locked away. The pasture was quiet, except for Titan, who grazed near the porch as though unwilling to leave. Inside, the house was hushed. Laura sat at Henry's bedside, Ethan curled in a chair beside her. Machines beeped softly, keeping time with shallow breaths. Ethan stirred, eyes red, and whispered, "Mom, what if he doesn't wake up?" Laura's hand tightened on his. She couldn't answer. Outside, Titan lifted his head suddenly, ears pricking toward the horizon. He let out a low, mournful call, a sound that rolled across the fields like a prayer. Henry's eyelids fluttered. His chest rose in a fragile breath. His cracked lips moved, barely audible. "Still here." Ethan bolted upright, tears streaming. "Grandpa!" Henry's eyes opened just enough to find the boy's face. "Promise me, no matter what happens, you keep Titan's trust. Never let him be caged again." Ethan nodded fiercely, gripping his hand. "I promise." Henry's eyes closed once more, his body sinking back into the pillows, his breathing shallow but steady for now. Titan stood outside the window, still as stone, watching. The morning sun caught his coat, making him glow like a sentinel carved of light. And in that fragile silence, one question lingered, heavier than the night's battle, sharper than Randall's threats. Would Henry live to see the future he had fought for, or would Titan's true keeper be Ethan alone? Henry and Titan face Randall's final assault. The horse proves his loyalty, saving the family, while Henry is gravely wounded. Randall is arrested, but the victory feels fragile. The family gathers around Henry's bedside, uncertain if he will survive. Ethan vows to honor his grandfather's promise, and Titan stands guard as if he already knows the weight of what's coming. The story closes on a cliffhanger. Henry alive, but barely leaving us with the haunting question, is this the end of Henry's fight, or the beginning of Ethan and Titan's legacy?